Washington Journal continues.
For a roundtable discussion this morning, we're joined by Minnesota Republican Jason Lewis, Virginia Democrat Bobby Scott, to talk about their bipartisan legislation to reform the criminal justice system. But before we get to that, Congressman Scott, with just days to go before a potential shutdown, just your thoughts on how the next couple of days play out.
Well, it's hard to say right now. I think there's a consensus that we're not going to shut the government down, but what gets into the bill is still being worked out. I would hope that we could come to an agreement and fund the government for the year. I come from an area that's very strong in defense. We find that it's virtually impossible to plan defense operations and defense shipbuilding, for example, on a monthly basis. You really need to be able to do long-term planning. So we're at a very strong disadvantage with these monthly continuing resolutions.
Congressman Lewis?
Yeah, I agree with that. We've passed the appropriations bills in the House. The Senate hasn't acted, so we end up getting backed into these CRs. We need an actual budget for what Bobby says on defense especially. But I think we'll get there, and I think we won't shut the government down, and we'll fund CHIPS, and we'll do something very important, I do believe, for my home state of Minnesota, and that's delay the medical devices tax, which is really a tax on sales, not a tax on profit. You can have a 0% gross margin and still get hit with this excise tax. So we'll get it done and hand it over to the Senate, I do believe, and we'll see if they want to shut the government down.
You don't think immigration or DACA gets included in this deal?
I don't think there's an appetite for that. I mean, there's a March deadline, and I think we can handle that separately, and I think that's the way we should.
Congressman Scott, on DACA?
There are a lot of important issues. The medical device tax, nobody likes taxes, but if you eliminate the medical device tax, then it wasn't put there by accident. It was put there so that the Affordable Care Act would be paid for. And there are a lot of things. The Cadillac tax, I don't like the Cadillac tax either. But if you're going to eliminate them, then come up with something else. And what we don't see is how you're going to make up the revenue. DACA is very important. Community health centers are important. The spending levels are important. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and frankly, we just haven't. I don't think we're any closer now than we were a month ago.
Do you think Democrats will make a stand this week on DACA and immigration reform?
Depends on what's in the bill.
And we'll see what's in the bill in the coming days. But one issue that you gentlemen agree on is criminal justice reform. How did you come together on this issue?
Well, I've been following this issue for a number of years in my old iteration as a talk show host. And this was important to me because, there used to be a line about don't make a federal case out of it. Remember that when you were a kid? Now there ought to be a federal law. And we have seen the federal criminal code expand exponentially. 2,000 more statutes since 1980, 4,500 plus federal criminal statutes. Look, I'm a conservative and I'm a believer in the 10th Amendment. These are primarily, especially between citizens of the same state, are issues for the police power. And as Bobby can explain, we've got a wide group of supporters from the right and the left on this. So I think you've got a liberal reason to support this, and you've got a conservative reason to support this, which is why, by the way, James Sensenbrenner worked with Representative Scott for years on this before I got to Congress.
What's the liberal reason to support this?
Well, I think you can take a step back. It's not even philosophical. It's a question of what you're doing with the criminal justice. Are you trying to codify slogans and sound bites and trying to get elected? Or are you trying to reduce crime and save money? Well, reducing crime and saving money is something that liberals and conservatives ought to be able to agree on. But if you're codifying slogans and sound bites, many of which not only don't reduce crime, some of them actually have been studied and add to crime. And so when you have a bill that reduces crime and saves money, I think it's something people ought to be able to agree on. And states are way out in front of this. I mean, the incarceration rate, as Jason has suggested, has exploded over the last 20 or 30 years. And it's gotten to the point where we have codified so many slogans and sound bites that states have figured out they can't afford it. Texas, for example, a few years ago, was faced with an estimate of $2 billion, one state, $2 billion in prison expansion costs to keep up with their prison population. Someone suggested that if you spend the money more intelligently, not just slogans and sound bites and prisons, if you put some money into prevention and early intervention and rehabilitation, you might not have to spend all $2 billion. Well, they spent not $2 billion, but $200 million, about 10% of what was projected, and found that they not only didn't have to build any new prisons, they were able to close some of the prisons they had. Now, that eliminated a $2 billion potential expense. That is something that people ought to be able to agree on. Reduce crime and save money.
It's the Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Justice Act, Safe Justice Act. You can take a look at it on our two members' websites, available online. We're taking your calls on it as well for about the next 40 minutes this morning on the Washington Journal. Democrats, it's 202-748-8000. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Independents, 202-748-8002. Congressman Lewis, on the prevention side and the early intervention side, what are some of the specific changes that you're recommending?
Well, evidence-based strategies, says Representative Scott. Do what works. Rehabilitation. Don't throw hardened criminals in with first-time offenders, things like that. But 32 states, to the representative's point, have made reforms, saved money, kept people out of prison, safer communities. I'm saying the laboratories of democracy ought to be allowed to work. We've had an increase of federal imprisonment by over 500% since 1980. The cost has gone from $970 million to $6.7 billion over the same time point. That's a 600% increase in federal prison costs. We simply can't afford to keep doing this, and so we have to allow the states to experiment. We have to reduce the federal criminal code, which I think is far too expansive, and get back to what works, as Representative Scott says. So evidence-based strategies is one thing, but regardless of what states do, we've got 32 states that have made these changes. Let's see how they play out. That's good 10th Amendment philosophy.
The federal prison population accounting for less than 13% of the total prison population in this country. Congressman Scott, why not focus more on the state side?
Well, a lot of it is state, and the problem is what the federal government does in terms of crime policy is mimicked by the states. So when we have draconian mandatory minimum sentences for low-level drug offenses, they tend to pick it up, and 3 strikes and you're out that we passed in the early 90s is picked up, and a lot of we serve as a model for the states. But the states have gotten to the point where they just can't afford to keep up. And they have, I know Washington State was faced with a lot of prison expansion, prison costs, and they did a study to come up with what has been shown to work to reduce crime on a cost-effective basis. And they went to things like early childhood education, which would be a long-term effect, working with prisoners on second chance programs to reduce the recidivism rate, in prison rehabilitation, so when they get out, they're better prepared to stay out. I mean, just a continuum, and you find, and you have this in the Safe Justice Act, a continuum of initiatives that are designed from a research-based perspective to reduce crime and save money. One of them is a significant reduction in mandatory minimums, which at some point require judges to impose sentences that violate common sense, and let the judge impose a sentence that makes sense, not one that because of the mandatory minimum he has to impose whether it makes any sense or not. In drug cases, we're seeing with the opioid crisis, nobody's talking about 5-year mandatory minimums. We're talking about services, mental health services, drug rehabilitation, to deal with the problem, and not the prison strategy.
Yeah, that's a really important point. These are medical issues, and with regard to some of these drug cases, and we don't want the DEA overturning what state prerogative is. It happened during the Clinton administration. It may happen during this one if the Attorney General gets his way. And I believe in the 10th Amendment, and I don't think it works, and I don't think you ought to put first-time drug offenders in with hardened criminals. That's a perfect example. We worked on the Juvenile Justice Bill before the Safe Justice Act, which passed the House, passed our committee unanimously, passed the House. And there's a thing there called a valid court order where you have a kid that runs away from school and the only reason he or she is in trouble is because of their age. Do you really want to throw them in with hardened criminals and keep them locked up? That's a good way to create another one, and I don't think that's wise policy.
You mentioned the drug issue. President Trump talked about the drug problem in the United States yesterday at the White House. Here's what he had to say.
We have a tremendous, massive drug problem and drug population, and we have dealers all over the country. And we are hitting them hard, the dealers. The dealers are being hit hard, but what they've done to families and what they're doing to the country, and it's something that we are very focused on. whether it's the opioids, whether it's drugs, as you hear in the traditional sense. Much comes through the southern border. You know that. People don't like to talk about it. They say, oh, why do you mention that? Because it happens to be true. But they come in through many different places and means, and they come in many different ways. But we are on the drug problem as much as you can possibly be on it. And we're going to get it taken care of one way or the other. And frankly, the tougher we get, the better it's going to be, the faster it's going to go away. We have got to get really tough on that problem because it's eating away at the heart of our country.
Congressman Scott, the president there, the tougher we get, the easier it's going to be. Do you agree?
Well, I mean, he suggested that you can deal with the drug problem by dealing with the supply. The problem with the drug problem is the demand. So long as people want the drugs, somebody will supply it. The idea that you can deal with the dealers, take somebody off the corner who's dealing drugs, you take him off the corner, you put him in jail on a long prison term. Well, tomorrow afternoon, somebody else is going to be at the same corner. You've really done nothing about the amount of drugs being consumed. You really have to deal with the demand. And when you've dealt with the demand, you've actually done something. Dealing with dealers, it's helpful, but it's not a cost-effective way of dealing with the drug problem. And you haven't heard that with the opioid problem. Congressman
Lewis, are you and the Trump administration on the same page here in dealing with these issues and this legislation?
I mean, it's been $1 trillion since the 1969 war on drugs. I think Bobby's point's a fair one. You got to reduce demand. Having said that, for hardened dealers, I mean, the big kingpins, yeah, I think there should be repercussions, serious repercussion. But that's part of what we're trying to do is reserve the scarce prison space for the real bad guys and not throw the first-time offender in with those folks and waste resources. Let's treat them, and much of this is a medical problem.
Let's bring in some callers. Liz is in New Jersey, line for Democrats. Liz, you're on with Congressman Bobby Scott and Jason Lewis.
Hello. I'm in support of criminal justice reform, especially for the massive inmates who are incarcerated at the state level. I spent 15 years teaching inmates in a New Jersey state prison, so I'm quite familiar with the population that's there. I think one thing that's distressed me with the opioid crisis is because it is hitting largely middle-class and upper-middle-class youth, we rule out immediately incarceration for them. But when I was teaching in the 1980s and 90s in the state prison, we had poor young men mainly who were addicted, and they were given large prison sentences, and we had very understaffed numbers of teachers and programs so that when they left, they could have a decent life. I think we need to revisit their original sentences. If they're paroled, we might want to think of expunging some of them. I don't think it's just let's look at the opioid crisis. These folks, their lives were drastically changed for the worse through their addiction problems, and nobody is talking about assisting them as they come out of prison or try to rebuild their lives on the outside.
Liz, thanks for the call. Congressman Scott.
Well, I think the response to the opioid crisis is more appropriate. It's being dealt with as a public health issue rather than a criminal justice issue, and I think that's the appropriate response. What happened in the past, well, we can't undo the past, but the Fair Sentencing Act that passed about 10 years ago did significantly reduce the penalties for very low-level possession-only cases. The Obama administration commuted sentences for those who had been given draconian mandatory minimums. I mean, his commutations were for those that were low-level, nonviolent, essentially first offenders who had already served 10 years. Well, the first thing that's got to occur to you is how did somebody, a low-level, nonviolent first offender, get so much time that after 10 years they still need help? And how is the society getting any benefit from the expenditure of money keeping people, low-level nonviolent offenders, for more than 10 years.
Do you think the Trump administration should commute more sentences?
Well, that's what the Obama administration did, and I think you ought to look at cases where sentences were obvious, just by any objective standard, excessive. But the response to the opioid crisis is much more appropriate, and I think we ought to look at that as a model.
Yeah, I agree with that. You don't want to get in a situation where you're putting mandatory minimums on people abusing prescription drugs, which is the problem, much more so than illicit drugs with regard to the opioid crisis. People getting too many prescriptions, prescription shopping, maybe getting back pain, which I know all about, and getting hooked on something like that. I don't think a mandatory minimum or 3 strikes you're out program is appropriate for that. So I'm glad to see that. Now, to the caller's point, that's a little different than, say, an MS-13 gang-infused neighborhood that is engaged in violence. So there's a proper role. We're trying to assess priorities for having the punishment fit the crime.
So in trying to do that, was this memorandum from the Attorney General back in May helpful? The Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, writing in May on the sentencing procedures, it's a core principle that prosecutors should charge and pursue the most serious, readily provable offense. This policy affirms our responsibility to enforce the law, is moral and just, and produces consistency. By definition, the most serious offenses are those that carry the most substantial guideline sentences, including mandatory minimum sentences.
Yeah, I'm not altogether certain that is the best way to go about this. But again, there are just too many federal crimes, and everything under this very elastic interstate commerce clause falls under federal jurisdiction, and that's one of the reasons I got interested in working with Representative Scott on this issue to make certain that everything isn't an interstate federal crime between 2 citizens of the same state. Let those laboratories of democracy figure out the best approach. There doesn't have to be a federal solution for everything.
And I think the better policy is to do what makes sense under the particular circumstances. Some of the mandatory minimums, you have the so-called girlfriend cases where you are technically, by taking a message or driving your boyfriend to a drug deal, you're part of the conspiracy. Your penalty is based on the quantity of the drugs in the conspiracy. So the girlfriend is sitting up there having taken a message, having driven the boyfriend to a drug deal. Judge looks up on the chart, 20-some years. Well, that's absurd under the circumstances, and you should not pursue that kind of mandatory minimum.
And they take their property under civil asset forfeiture, which doesn't have due process
Another
rights.
topic we've talked quite a bit about on this program. To Andrew, waiting in Fall River, Massachusetts. Line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Franco. I was born in a large Portuguese Christian family. We all went to Catholic school until high school, except me, because I was born with severe learning disabilities. And I stayed back in Catholic school in first grade once, second grade twice. They shoved me into public school. The third grade teacher in public school was the only teacher that tried to help me. In sixth grade, I got tested by a specialist.
So Andrew,
and the school boards.
Andrew, bring us to criminal justice reform.
They have. This is part of the justice thing, to where I could drop out, or they're just going to keep me till I'm 21 and thing. Most of my friends ended up in jail. A lot of these people that end up on the corners selling drugs and doing crimes are people like me who have no other way to make money. And if you get the education done and money for it, a lot of these people would end up at least getting jobs to where they could do. I work barely minimum wage. I barely read. I mean, I went from sixth grade to 10th grade.
Andrew, thanks for sharing your story. I'll let you talk to the ranking member of the House Education and Workforce Committee.
There's a strong correlation between dropping out of school and a trajectory towards crime. Everybody drops out, doesn't commit a crime, but the chance of you getting involved in the criminal justice system is a lot higher if you've dropped out of school. Dropout prevention programs have been shown to significantly reduce future crime.
Are those programs included in this legislation?
There's a provision that you can invest in prevention programs generally, on a locally tailored basis. Dropout prevention programs ought to be one. There are savings by eliminating the many of the mandatory minimums, not for the highest, the kingpin, the real kingpins, but for the lower level offenses. There's a significant reduction in mandatory minimums, and that can be reprogrammed to prevention and early intervention programs.
Congressman Lewis,
I would just say before we get to the Safe Justice Act, we got to get juvenile justice reform through. It's passed both houses. It's being held up from going to conference for this vacated or valid court order exception, which I think is an obstacle. But this will pass if we can just get it to conference and get this worked out. That is sort of the precursor, if you will, to criminal justice reform for adults. And so Representative Scott and I have worked hard on juvenile justice reform. There's no reason this shouldn't pass and be signed into law this session.
Let's go to Gina in Decatur, Alabama. Line for Republicans. Gina, go ahead.
Yes, John. Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN, as always. I have a couple of points. Governor Kay Ivey in May of 2017 authorized under our moral fortitude or whatever, and she gave back Alabama citizens the right to vote, and we elected Doug Jones. And I'm a Republican, and I did vote for Doug Jones. And to me, that's some of our part of criminal justice reform, even though Alabama is known for violations. And my second point is, you talk about criminal justice reform, but like Department of Justice Secretary Jeff Sessions about the marijuana and California being a sanctuary state, these are violations of our laws. So, I mean, if y'all want to talk law, we'll talk law. And thank you, and God bless you.
Gina, appreciate the call. Congressman Scott, let you start.
Well, first on the marijuana, I don't think there's any question that if it's illegal on a federal basis, it's illegal. But the question is in prosecutorial discretion. Is this something we want to spend our money on in a state where it is legal under state law, whether we want to enforce the federal law? And I think it's something that Congress is just going to have to deal with legislatively. But since states have legalized it, the prosecutorial discretion on the federal level has been not to prosecute people who are conforming with the state law.
You know, the Constitution protects the states and the people from the federal government. The police power of the states protect us from one another. That is primarily the criminal. I think it was Justice Marshall who said, in general, back in the 19th century, there is no federal criminal code. 2 or 3 crimes are mentioned in the Constitution. Why do we have 4,500 federal statutes? That's a real driver on this legislation for me, to restore that principle of subsidiarity so that government closest to home can govern best.
Steve is in Pennsylvania. Line for Independence. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, C-SPAN, for having this conversation. I listened to the president's statement as far as getting hard on drug dealers, and if I was to give him a message, it would be, if he truly wants to keep kids off drugs, end marijuana prohibition. We know it's the gateway, not the drug. It's the drug dealers who don't card. For our representatives on the program, I would ask that they work to remove marijuana from Schedule 1. You see a child, kids can get on a computer, they can look up Schedule 1 drugs, they see marijuana, they see opiates. They try marijuana, gee, nothing happens, I didn't die. Maybe the other drugs are fine. So
Congressman Lewis, I'll let you start this time.
Well, that is the great irony of prohibition. Sometimes it encourages people to try something they're not supposed to. We had that experience, obviously. I think it was Rockefeller who was one of the leading proponents of prohibition, then became the leading advocate to undo it. And the Schedule 1 point is a good one, especially when it comes to medical marijuana. If we're going to study and see the efficacy of this particular drug, you've got to take it off that so it can be studied. So I'm sympathetic to what the caller suggests, and indeed I've co-sponsored a number of pieces of legislation to that effect.
Yeah, I agree. If you look at alcohol, why is an alcohol considered a gateway drug? It's because you don't have to deal with a drug dealer to get alcohol. When you have to deal with, in most states now, you have to deal with a drug dealer to be able to get marijuana. Once you have that relationship, you also are able to get other drugs. And so the gateway to other drugs is because you had to deal with a drug dealer to get marijuana. And there's a question as whether you sever that, if you sever that relationship, whether it ceases again to be a gateway drug any more than alcohol.
And the black market profits of something being prohibited by that. I mean, that encourages people to go where the highest margins are.
To bring it back to the Safe Justice Act, have you been guaranteed floor time or committee time for this in this Congress?
Well, we're trying to get more co-sponsors on, predominantly on my side of the aisle, to be perfectly honest, and I think we will. I think this is a conservative issue for all the reasons I've mentioned, but it's also got some liberal components on rehabilitation, and I think that's good. But right now, we have not, that I know of, Representative Scott.
Well, we're trying to get other co-sponsors and other organizational support. It has the potential of getting significant conservative and liberal support because it reduces crime and saves money. There are other proposals that, when you look at them, do not do much on mandatory minimums. They may adjust them, but do not really deal with the mass incarceration problem. And so I think
and the groups that are supporting us are from all over the spectrum.
All over the spectrum.
I mean, FreedomWorks to NAACP.
What do you think it'll take to get the Trump administration specifically on board with this legislation?
We need to pass a bill, and then we need to force the issue.
Well, and I think there's a
But couldn't President Trump's support help pass that bill beforehand?
I think President Trump would sign juvenile justice reform, which is the start. I do.
And I think you have a threshold question. Are you willing to reduce crime and save money? Or are you going to get stuck on codifying slogans and sound bites that don't do anything in terms of crime reduction and are very expensive? They've gotten us to the point where the prison population has exploded and we've gotten no criminal justice value for that money.
Were either of you involved in that meeting last week the president held, the listening sessions on prison reform?
I was not.
No, I was not. But prison reform is one area where you can make a significant difference because people leaving prison in most states are back in prison, a majority are back in prison within a couple of years. If you can have programs in prison that enable them to get a job when they get out, they're much less likely to come back. So a significant portion of the over incarceration, the mass incarceration problem, of people that are in prison that keep coming back. And if prison reform provides programs, education, job training, so that they're better able to deal with, get a job and not come back.
To Lawrenceville, Georgia, Gary's a Democrat. Gary, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I have a stepson that was in federal prison. He hurt his knee in federal prison, and he didn't get any medical attention to his knee, so therefore now he's disabled. He cannot work. He can't go out of state to get a job or anything because of all the restrictions that the government has put on ex-prisoners. So how are y'all expecting for these people that get out of prison to get a nice job, to go someplace when they're stuck in the state, then they can't go anyplace else? I mean, it's totally ridiculous. And as far as the drugs are concerned, yes, I agree that some drugs should be legalized. The majority of the problem that we're having with drugs is people like drug dealers are stamping on drugs. They're adding their piece of thing to the drugs, and therefore there's the bigger problem. If you would legalize the drugs, therefore you can control them, and you know what's in the drug.
Congressman Scott, let you start.
Well, for the medical treatment in prison is a challenge, and I don't think we do the oversight about medical treatment in prison that we ought to. In many of the states, it is a real problem.
Well, we have a de facto legalization. They're called prescriptions, and that's the epicenter of the opioid crisis. So just legalizing drugs isn't going to solve the problem. We've got to address demand and abuse and that sort of thing. I can't comment to the caller's personal experience with regard to his relative.
How does a drug court work?
Well, I mean, the drug courts, certainly to the degree they get federal money, can try different strategies, and we're trying to loosen those up even more to not require on mandatory minimums and 3 strikes and you're out, things like that. So to give them more leeway at the state level. But again, my emphasis and my interest in this legislation is allowing the most latitude we can for local courts.
The bill provides what we call problem-solving courts, drug courts being one. And we found, and what they do, and if you've ever been to a graduation, you see the transformational effect they have. You deal with the drug problem. People come in on a burglary charge or this charge, nothing. The fundamental problem they got is drugs. If you can deal with the drug problem, you can solve the other problems. And a lot of individuals don't want to deal with the drug court because it is a long, many 6 months to a year process where you're coming back and forth to the court.
What should determine whether somebody should be sent to that system as opposed to jail?
The probation department evaluates the situation, and part of it is whether or not the person wants to go through with this. If they can deal with their problem, and a lot of people come in addicted and with a lot of problems, can't work, lost their family, get into a drug court, get off drugs. Part of it is you got to start finding a job, and so you can't graduate until you're back working on a job, free of drugs. And the stories you hear are just miracles about the transformational effect that these courts have. You have drug courts, veterans courts, where you have veterans who deal with the specific problems of veterans, post-traumatic stress and other problems. They'll have a mentor. Mental health courts where the underlying problem is a mental health problem, and so and they'll get mental health treatment as part of the process. But these problem-solving courts deal with the problem rather than just have people come in and out with the same underlying problem they had.
Yeah, we've heard for years, the insanity defense. You don't want to make a criminal case into a medical case, and the people will abuse that. But you also don't want to take a medical case and make it a criminal case. These are medical problems. These are public health issues in many cases, and that's the way we have to deal with it.
To Danbury, Connecticut, line for Republicans. Ed, good morning.
Hi, good morning. I'd like your perspective as to why we as a society want to incarcerate so many people. As you know, our rate is the highest in the world. I mean, what's so attractive about it politically that, that's the course we follow?
Congressman Lewis, I'll let you start with that as I show the international rates of incarceration per 100,000 people in the United States, over 600, well ahead of other countries around the world.
Yeah, we do have a very high incarceration rate and the most number of people behind bars. I think a lot of that is due to the prohibition on substances, especially in minority communities. It's had a profound impact there, and that is something that we've got to address head on. Having said all that, justice is just that. There ought to be a punishment that fits a crime, especially for violent criminals, and no one's talking about going backward on that. The whole point of the Safe Justice Act and juvenile justice reform is to make certain that we're in a country with a $20 trillion debt. A number of states have financial challenges to reserve that precious prison space for the most violent offenders that present the greatest threat to society.
We are so far above most industrialized countries. It's 600 and some. Most countries are able to get by locking up 100 to 200, some as low as 50 per 100,000, and we're at 600, way above the rest of the industrialized world. And most of it is the war on drugs.
To Jim in Ohio, line for Independence. Jim, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to make a point with the congressman. There's a common pleas court in Akron, Ohio, that does exactly what these two congressmen are trying to get passed. And if they can do it in Akron, Ohio, I don't understand why it takes so long in Congress to get your laws passed. The other thing I'd like to say, if the Congress could get together like normal human beings and get together and quit all their tomfoolery and quit picking up and backing into the pay windows and you guys should be on Obamacare, but instead you're on this Cadillac health care. Why don't you reduce some of your health expenses?
Jim, a couple issues there. Congressman Lewis, let you start.
Well, actually, we are on the D.C. exchange for the Affordable Care Act. But look, a lot of it is politics. People don't want to be seen weak on crime, and they don't want to be seen lacking compassion on the other side of the aisle. So people play games with this. But to the caller's point about these local courts that are doing it, that's exactly where we're trying to go with this.
As he said, the problem-solving courts are part of the Safe Justice Act. We are on Obamacare just like everybody else. And I think the fact that we're here working together on criminal justice reform shows that there are some things we can work together on.
Adele, Auburn, Massachusetts, line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for C-SPAN. What about the corporations like McKesson that are distributing opioids all over the world, illegally, and they just got a huge tax break? And also, I just wanted to say the fentanyl is coming in, that's killing everybody, is coming in from China. And, I just wondered if they had any thoughts on those two points.
Congressman Scott, let you start.
Well, I think, frankly, if you're going to deal with the drug problem, it ought to be dealt with from the prevention aspect. You have to deal with the underlying problem. You find that people, areas with the highest use of opioid, you'll find unemployment, poverty, and a lot of other problems. So we have to deal with that. In terms of the tax break, I didn't support the tax bill for other reasons, but that's
another discussion to have.
You don't want to pick and choose who gets a certain tax rate based on this sort of social policy, I don't believe. This is a tough issue, but I'm very concerned about the people that live with chronic pain. And I want to Bobby's point, we've got to address the demand side, but we don't want to go into a situation where people who actually need pain relief from some of these drugs can't get it in our zeal to cure this epidemic. I think that would be going backwards.
To Minnesota, Anthony's on our line for Democrats. Anthony, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. My issue is that I haven't heard anybody speak about banning the box. As long as you have the box where people are ex-felons have this on them, they're never going to get jobs. And if you don't have a job, you get sent out. Part of your probation or parole is gainful employment. And we don't, in this country, we don't allow people a second chance. If you're not going to give them a second chance, then you might as well keep them in there because there's no way that they're going to stay out of jail. And another thing is that education. We spend way too much money on defense. We should spend more on education because everybody in this country, we need our kids to be smart of having to worry about getting people from other countries to come in and take these jobs. We need to be educating the ones that are here. And what are we spending so much money to protect if we're going to have, if there's going to be garbage, no infrastructure, nothing? We're wasting our money on the industrial complex, the military industrial complex.
Got your point, Congressman.
Well, that $20 trillion debt I spoke of is there for a reason. We spend more on incarceration, but we also spend more per pupil on education than any other country. So it cuts both ways sometimes.
Ban the box has been proposed as a way to deal with the problem. Some people aren't considered for jobs. As soon as they check the box, they're no longer considered. We have to make sure that that's working the way it's supposed to work. But job training in prison is extremely important, so they are qualified for jobs when they get out. It's going to be difficult if you have a record. It's going to be more difficult for you to get a job than somebody without a record.
See if we can get in Terry from Akron, Ohio, line for Independence. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for C-SPAN. I guess this is directed more at Mr. Scott, and I know he's been working on this for a long time, and I followed him, and I applaud him. But I am so disappointed with the Democrats, especially with this DACA. And I know they can wear two hats at once and they can deal with DACA, but this issue with the disproportionate number of blacks being thrown in jail and police brutality, this is the issue that Democrats should stop the government, shut down the government for. And DACA could be put on a separate side and dealt with that. but they would rather shut the government down for DACA, and all of these black guys are in prison or being shot, etc. Deal with that, and I like to just hang up and listen to you. Thank you.
Well, as you said, we can do more than one thing at the same time. DACA is just one of the issues. It's an important issue. Spending levels, another issue. Community health centers, CHIP, children's health, apparently will be dealt with by the end of the week. But he mentioned mass incarceration and police brutality. One of the things, when you get to the end of the debate about police brutality, the response will be police training. And the bill includes money for police training. That will be able to deal with police brutality, deal with how to deal with situations where people are being killed, how to deal with profiling and other things. When you get to the end of the debate, if you don't, and police training is expensive. If you don't have money for police training, you're not going to be able to deal with these situations. And the mass incarceration, one of the drivers of that is mandatory minimum sentences, which are eliminated in the Safe Justice Act.
The caller points out you've been working on this a long time. What's it going to take for it to get done this year?
Well, we came close last year. Some alternatives were offered, which, frankly, when they were scored, it didn't do that much. And in the confusion, nothing got done. We're going to start up again, and hopefully we'll be able to make more progress.
Congressman Lewis?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We just got to keep pushing on this. But I think the time is on our side. People are seeing that the current system just isn't working and it isn't properly reserving to the states the ability to experiment with the best programs.
It's the Safe, Accountable, Fair, and Effective Justice Act, the Safe Justice Act. The two lead co-sponsors joining us today. Hope you do so again. Thank you so much for your time.
You bet, John.
Thank you.
Up next on the Washington Journal, we return to this question we asked at the top of our show. Your message to Congress on the shutdown debate. Lines for Democrats, Republicans, and independents on your screen. You can start calling in now, and we'll be right back.